Good morning, everyone, and welcome to part one of Designing and Operating Roads for the Aging Population. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentation today, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have. Looking at the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel, please note also that a PDF copy of the course presentation is available for reference. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to Mark Doctor. Hello.
Hey, Mike. Hey, thanks. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning for this workshop on designing roadways for the aging population. My name is Mark Doctor, and I'm with the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center Safety and Design team. I am physically out of Atlanta, Georgia, but basically work to serve all the states and nationwide, and very happy to be partnering with Ohio LTAP for this session. We've done this session in previous years, and it's always been a great group and a lot of great questions, and so I'm glad we have this opportunity to team up again and present this workshop for you. So the workshop today is going to be broken up into two parts. We're going to start with this morning piece, and the Eastern time will go from 10 to about 11:30. We're going to cover the topic of why this course and why the Federal Highway Administration Handbook on designing and operating roads for the aging population. And we'll review some of the age-related capabilities that typically diminish as we age, and how that influences choices that we can make as roadway designers and operators, transportation practitioners. Give us a sense of understanding what the issues are, and then linking them to design and operational recommendations that come from the FHWA handbook. And we'll start off talking about intersections. And there's a lot to talk about when it comes to what we can do to design and operate intersections safer and better accommodate our aging population. And then we'll take a break, and you can log out of the room or stay in the room, but it'll be the same GoToWebinar link to get back in. And we'll start up again promptly at 1 o'clock Eastern time, and we'll go from 1 to 2:30 this afternoon with part two of the session. And we'll finish up the recommendations with intersections. We'll also take questions along the way. So like Mike mentioned, please type in questions as they come up for you, and we'll periodically take some pauses along the way to address some of the questions that are entered. And then in the afternoon, we'll talk about a important part of the FHWA handbook, and that is some information and recommendations with regard to when to consider these recommendations, how to do an assessment. We'll go through a hypothetical scenario of how these recommendations could be applied, and walk through some of the worksheets that are found in the FHWA handbook. Also, we'll close out with some other parts of the handbook, design and operations recommendations that deal with freeway interchanges and roadway segments. So that's kind of what's on tap for today. So let's start up with why are we having this workshop, and why did FHWA produce this handbook on designing roadways for an aging population? Well, quite simply, it's because we are an aging population. If we look at the demographics, we have more older users on the road, and those numbers are going to continue to build as the decades come about. You may have heard the phrase the gray tsunami. Well, that is certainly true. The number of Americans age 65 and older is projected to nearly double by 2060. So what that means is more older users on the road, not just drivers, but also pedestrians, bicyclists, transit users. And so what that means to us as transportation practitioners is if we think about what is a typical user, or what should be our design person, our design human, right? We select a design vehicle, and maybe we lay out our roadway geometrics based upon the attributes and characteristics of a design vehicle. Well, what about a design person and the physical, the cognitive abilities of that person? Well, we have to make certain assumptions, but we also want our selections to be representative of the population. And so as we age, what is representative of our population basically shifts to be an older person. So in Ohio, we certainly know that older driver safety is an important issue. It's identified in the Ohio Strategic Highway Safety Plan as a top strategy or a top priority. And people age 65 and older represent the fastest growing segment of drivers, not just nationally, but also in Ohio. And those numbers are going to continue to rise. If we look at the numbers of fatalities and serious injuries, well, some not so good news. Fatalities and serious injuries kicked up among the 65 and older group in Ohio, but also nationally, we of course have seen at best a plateauing of our safety numbers, the fatalities and serious injuries, and then in recent years, the trend is disturbing and going in the wrong direction. So a lot of work, a lot of opportunities for us. Now there is some good news, especially in relation to older driver safety. And that is that typically, so again, I hate to overgeneralize, but generally, older drivers tend to be safer drivers. And what that means is they are less likely to be aggressive. They are less likely to speed. Again, these are generalizations. Perhaps less likely to intentionally be operating a vehicle while under the influence. And yes, there are, of course, issues with medications and how medications can affect us as drivers. But generally speaking, if we look at the behavioral aspects of driver safety, older drivers tend to be in that better behavioral category. Again, a generalization. Also, older drivers have experience, and the experienced drivers can help. So typically we look at the two far ends of the spectrum, the younger driver group and the older driver group. But the good news is that older drivers generally have a lower involvement rate in crashes. Now, another interesting statistic here on this graph, the difference between male and female drivers, and wow, that that disparity kind of throughout all the age groups, but I'm not even gonna touch that one. But still, it's just one interesting phenomenon. So that's the good news about older drivers. They do tend to be safer. Now, the not so good news, even though older drivers perhaps are less likely to be involved in a crash, so they have a lower overall crash involvement rate. The bad news is when older drivers are involved in a crash, though they tend to be overrepresented in terms of the severity. So a severe injury or a fatality. So this is particularly true for drivers in that 80 and above category. And a lot of this simply has to do with our bodies, our human bodies becoming frail as we age. So if we take the exact same collision and a person as an occupant in a car involved in a collision, and let's say that the same types of vehicles involved, the same speeds, the same angles of collision, all else being equal, if you have a younger person in the vehicle versus an older person that maybe even has some pre-existing medical conditions, the survivability of the crash is going to vary between someone who's younger, able to recover from their injuries versus an older person. So that's the not so good news, is that older drivers tend to be overrepresented when they are in a crash in terms of the severity of the consequence of that crash. And then the fatality rate by age group, we see here a little bit of an elevation for that age group of 75 to 79. But what really starts to stand out is when we look at that group of 80 and above. That's when the fatality rate really starts to kick up. And we are an aging society, but we are especially aging in this 80 and above group. So by 2050, the population, or the number of folks 85 and older, will be about 3 times what it currently is. So if we think about how many people today, older people 80 and above, are enjoying good health, they're on the roads, they're driving, they enjoy good mobility. Well, those numbers of people 80 and above will be much higher in the future. So things that we can do now to help plan and accommodate our aging population. And I like to make a connection between the things that we're going to talk about in this workshop and how it relates to the safe system approach to considering roadway safety, because I think it's a wonderful connection with how we could view, or should view, designing and operating roads for an aging population. So if you haven't heard about the safe system approach, and I hope you have, but the safe system approach is rapidly gaining attention and awareness. It really is a philosophy or a practice. It's not simply an infrastructure based approach. It's really a holistic approach to how we think about the roadway safety problem, and it offers a different opportunity to think about the solutions to that problem. And the approach is really based upon 6 foundational principles. And the first principle is that death and serious injuries on the road are unacceptable. And so it's almost a moral imperative that when we set out to design and operate roads, that we hold safety and the preservation of life as the highest goal that we should be striving for. And notice I said the preservation of life and eliminating deaths and serious injuries, and I didn't say eliminate crashes. It's a subtle difference, but an important difference. When we say vision zero, we are not talking about 0 crashes. We are talking about 0 deaths and serious injuries. And that's where this second principle comes in, that humans make mistakes. Under a safe system approach, we acknowledge that human beings, as users in the road system, whether we're drivers, whether we're pedestrians or bicyclists, we will inevitably make mistakes. Even the best of us will make mistakes. And so it really doesn't even matter if the errors that are made on the system are intentional or unintentional. We know that mistakes are going to happen. And on the road system, those mistakes can lead to crashes. The trick, or the goal of the safe system approach, is to manage the consequence of that collision. And that's where the third principle comes in, that humans are vulnerable. So we have a certain threshold or ability to absorb collision forces before harm occurs. And as we think about designing for the aging population, well, if we think about a design vehicle, and if we think about a design user, all right, well, perhaps our design user should be an older person. And the focus is then on acknowledging that people will make mistakes. And we know that for our aging population, because of diminishing abilities as drivers, diminished abilities as pedestrians, that diminished abilities can be a contributing factor to errors or mistakes on the road that can lead to crashes. We need to accept that fact that that will happen, and then focus on what we can do to design and operate the system so that when mistakes happen, and if we can, we should design out the opportunity for mistakes, at least ones that would involve a severe collision, a severe traffic conflict, and then operate the system such that we are staying within those thresholds of what the human body can absorb. So those first three principles really tie in nicely to this philosophy of designing for an aging population. Responsibility is shared. The fourth principle of a safe system approach reemphasizes that this is not just a infrastructure effort. That this really is a collaborative effort among all of the elements of a safe system. It does begin with safe road users. Focusing on behavioral safety aspects is still a very vital and key aspect of a safe system approach. But we know that people will inevitably make mistakes. We hope that our vehicles keep becoming safer and safer as we get toward more advanced safety systems and even on the verge of autonomous operating systems, or things like automated braking systems, or pedestrian front detection systems with automated braking. All of these advancements are rapidly making progress. And so safe vehicle technology is a key part of the safe system approach. Operating with safe speeds, having safe roads that try to design out the severe conflicts. And then that last element, the last line of defense, is post-crash care, getting rapid emergency medical attention out there. This can be a particular challenge in rural areas where perhaps the nearest trauma center might be some distance away, but post-crash care is almost that last line of defense in preventing a fatality or serious injury. And then the final two principles, safety being proactive, doing what we can to design safety into the system rather than being reactive to high crash locations. And redundancy is crucial. So safe roads alone cannot achieve a safe system. It really has to be all five of these elements working together. And we may never get to a point where each element by itself is ever going to be 100% foolproof. We will always have risks. And with safe roads, what we're trying to do is reduce the risk that a fatality or serious injury will occur. And even if we never get that risk down to zero, which we probably wouldn't, but as we shift along this continuum of reducing the likelihood that a crash on our road system would result in a fatality or serious injury, that is how we evolve toward creating a safe system. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not like flipping a switch. It takes time, it takes effort, but it also takes strengthening all five elements so that none of the five elements by themselves has to be perfect, but they react with each other and support each other to work in concert to help avoid a fatal or severe injury consequence. So that's the safe system approach summary in a nutshell, and why I think it's so important in terms of its connection to designing roadways for the aging population. Now, everything or most everything that we're going to talk about today is derived from the FHWA handbook for designing roadways for the aging population. There is both a handbook that you can download from the FHWA's webpage, but there's also a handy desk reference. And the desk reference keeps the information limited to just the recommendations, whereas the full handbook includes a lot of the background information, a lot of the supporting research that led to the recommendations. So if you want the full blown version with all the recommendations, I'd encourage you to download the handbook. If you're primarily just interested in the recommendations themselves, then the desk reference is a great resource. Both of these available from FHWA as free PDF files to download. So before we begin, let me just ask somewhat humorous question. I'm sure we have all encountered older drivers as we are on the road. And so I just want to ask, are there any characteristics or anything about the older drivers that you've observed on the roadway that maybe annoys you? Maybe if you're behind a older driver on the road. So with that, I'm going to ask Mike to pull up a poll pod here, and let's just see what what people think about things that could possibly annoy us.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Yes, we have launched the first poll question, and we see responses coming in already. So we invite everyone to submit their answer. And we'll provide a few seconds for people to do that. All right, more responses coming in. A few more seconds. Great, and we will close the polling and share the results. So Mark, here's what we have. 48% said A, 22% said B, 26% said C, 4% said other.
Yeah, all right, very good. So yeah, and you have to remind me, Mike, which one was A again?
A was they drive slow.
Yeah, they drive slow, and there are many attributes about older drivers, and yeah, I guess the common one that we sometimes hear is, yeah, they drive slow. Every once in a while, you see the issue of the turn indicator, the blinker staying on, even though they're not turning or have no intention to turn, or that they're hesitant, maybe slow to pull out from a minor street or a driveway to make a left turn or a crossing maneuver, or getting real slow to make a right turn. So these things that we observe with older drivers, that there's actually reasons why these happen. And so I want to segue into the next section here that provides an overview of age-related diminishing capabilities. And we're going to talk about visual capabilities that naturally diminish as we age, some physical mobility capabilities, and cognitive capabilities. Now, we all age at different rates. So the phrase age is just a number is very true because it's a very individual thing that some people are blessed with excellent health well into their upper years, but no doubt there are examples where just as part of the natural aging process, our visual, physical, and cognitive abilities tend to diminish at different rates, but it's natural. It's part of being human. And these diminishing capabilities do influence driving tasks. And so things that we can do to design and operate our traffic control devices to better meet the needs of an aging population and relate it to the perceptual, physical, and cognitive needs. So let's start with the visual capabilities. We'll talk about each of these six visual capabilities that diminish, starting with reduced visual acuity. And visual acuity is basically the sharpness of our vision. If you think about taking a standard eye exam and our ability to discern letters or numbers of a given size at a given distance, that's visual acuity. And of course, it relates directly to our roadway signs. Signing is typically the way that we as traffic engineering professionals convey vital information to users. And so users need to be able to see these signs, read them, And as they are in motion, the size, the lettering size of the signs, the overall visibility of the signs is critical. So as our ability and capabilities for visual acuity start to diminish, what that translates to is perhaps the need for larger signs and larger lettering on signs. The second visual capability that tends to diminish with age is contrast sensitivity being reduced. And contrast sensitivity is our visual ability to discern between different objects or different things that may have similar color, similar brightness, but they are different. So if you think about a pavement marking, so a white or a yellow pavement marking on a black asphalt pavement, or more of a grayish concrete pavement, the contrast between the pavement marking and the roadway example, or the roadway color is an example of where contrast sensitivity comes into play in the driving task. So as we have reduced contrast sensitivity, what that could mean is objects may seem a little fuzzy, or the edges are ill-defined. Think about the case of a curb, a concrete curb on the roadside, and how that could blend into either the pavement, or depending upon what is on the other side of the curb, if it's grass, or also a gray sidewalk and concrete. So the ability to actually discern where the pavement ends, where the curb is, where the sidewalk begins. All of these are examples of how we use contrast sensitivity. And of course, other conditions like glare and the level of lighting, fog can make a difference as well. So even without aging, sometimes our contrast sensitivity is impacted by natural factors. So contrast sensitivity, another key feature. And as we age, if users have, say, cataracts that start to develop in the eyes, that can also affect contrast sensitivity. And so from a roadway safety standpoint, it might come into play on a gray day, and a gray winter's day, and someone with cataracts and not able to discern the sharpness and have fuzziness may not be able to discern, say, a pedestrian that is walking out in front. So all of these issues come into play. Contrast sensitivity is not something that is typically included in a routine eye exam. It's not something that is typically part of a eye test for getting or keeping a driver's license, but there are ways to test for contrast sensitivity. The third ability is the reduction in our area of visual attention, also known as the useful field of view or the functional field of view. So the area of visual attention, especially in the driving task, it's a fairly narrow window, but it's that window where, as a driver, we're able to detect motion and able to see whether it be a oncoming vehicle, or a vehicle on a side street, or coming out of a driveway, or a pedestrian, or a bicyclist. And that area of visual attention is also influenced as drivers by how fast we're going. The faster we're traveling, actually our window of visual attention starts to narrow. But this is where we are most likely to observe important things. Traffic signals, traffic signs. It's a goal to place those within our area of visual attention. Things that are outside of our area of visual attention, even though we may see them. If you think about your peripheral vision, and one of the exercises or activities that we can do In person, if this were a live workshop, I would ask everyone to kind of hold their hands out to the side, and you can do this at home if you want. So basically hold your arms out extended to the side at like 180 degrees. And if you wiggle your fingers, it looks straight ahead. So if you're looking straight ahead at your computer, can you see your fingers wiggling out of the corners of your eyes? And then start bringing your hands closer together in front of you. And at what point can you actually notice that your fingers are wiggling? So this is an example of how you can gauge your peripheral vision, but when you can really see something detailed, it's a fairly narrow cone of view. And in fact, to read a sign, to have the acuity, the visual acuity to actually read a sign, that's a very narrow cone of view. That's only about 2 to 4 degrees wide. So if you think about, well, like say a book that's in front of you, or a piece of paper with writing on it, in order to view, you may be able to see that book or that letter, but to actually read it, to discern the letters and to actually read something, you really have to focus on a very negative cone of view to be able to read. So when we think about our signs, and yeah, we need them to be in the useful field of view, but the driver to actually read the sign will have to shift their focus, shift their focal attention to a very narrow degree, and that can also influence what is being seen in the useful field of view. So all of this is very important, but sadly, it's also something that diminishes naturally as we age. And then another capability is our ability to perceive changes in motion or discern the apparent size, the visual size of an object as it approaches. So this comes into play when we are drivers and trying to judge for a gap in traffic. Perhaps we're coming out of a minor street or a side road, and the major street does not stop. It's uncontrolled. And so as drivers, we have to make a judgment. What speed is that vehicle approaching? How far away are they? Do I have enough time, basically, to execute a left turn movement or a crossing maneuver? And so these abilities to make judgments about an object's distance, how fast it's moving, these tend to diminish as we age. Another example would be at a signalized intersection with a permissive left turn, where the driver has to make a judgment about an approaching oncoming traffic, and is there enough of a gap to make a permissive left turn. These are all common challenges that we see with older drivers. And it's really challenging for drivers of any age. If we think about the relationship between the change in an image size and try to judge its speed, well, even for a younger person or a person with excellent vision, making those judgments is not easy, because the laws of physics, you really don't see that much of a change in the size of an image until it's well within 500 feet. All right, so the difference between how much that the view that we would have, or the apparent change in size of an approaching car between 1,000 feet and 500 feet is kind of modest. And then within 500 feet, okay, then it starts to become more apparent. So it's not easy for any age, and at higher speeds, the distance covered in 500 feet is not very much. So speed and gap judgment definitely tends to be an issue that becomes very apparent when we look at aging user safety. And then the last two visual capabilities: increase sensitivity to glare. So at night, with headlights, or if we have a rainy condition or wet pavement and the reflection of light off of wet pavement, all of these issues with light glare can interfere with our focal vision, and it becomes more of a problem, or greater interference, as we tend to age. And then lastly, the ability to adapt from going to lighted conditions to dark conditions. So that this could be examples of where we may have street lighting, and then into an area where we don't have street lighting, or perhaps an intersection that is lit. And then once we leave the intersection, we go back to an area that is unlit. So our ability for the eyeball to basically adapt to a case of letting more or letting less light in because it's better lit, to then the scenario of a darker condition and having to adapt to being able to see in the darker condition can naturally diminish as we age. And recently when I walked into a movie theater, I remember as a kid, I could sneak into a movie theater well after the movie started, and I could see, I could find an open seat, get in and sit down. But now I'm finding it harder to walk into a dark theater and really see, well, what seats are open, what row do I need to go to. So it's just something that naturally diminishes as we age, and certainly can affect us as aging users. So well, one thing I didn't mention is that in the download box is a participant workbook. So not only does it have most of the slides that you're viewing here, but it also has some background activity or background information and some activities. And one quick little participant activity that is in your workbook is this example of things that we could do or typically do as safety enhancements on the road, and how that relates to the visual abilities that we just talked about. So for example, roadway lighting. Well, roadway lighting really can help in a lot of ways, but I would say that it is particularly helpful for helping overcome those diminished abilities with contrast sensitivity, the reduction in perception to changes in motion. If you think about how difficult it is to judge the approach, the speed and the gap of an approaching vehicle, if you're trying to make a left turn out of a minor street or a driveway. Well, what if you can't even see the car that's approaching? All you can see are the headlights. That makes it even more challenging. So roadway lighting can help, and it helps just drivers to better make out the objects, the key objects, even those in motion that we need to make appropriate judgments with regard to gaps and speeds and distances. And certainly for the diminished ability to adapt from lighted to dark conditions, if we have consistent and uniform roadway lighting, that helps with that area. Protected only signal phasing, so left turn signal phasing, and reductions in our ability to gauge for gaps, acceptable gaps. Well, if we have protected only signal phasing, we're basically not placing a driver in that situation where they do have to make a judgment in a gap for oncoming traffic. Larger signs and sign lettering, obviously that helps with reductions in visual acuity. Having high quality reflective pavement markings can be very helpful to overcome the reduced visual contrast sensitivity concerns. Overhead mounted lane assignment signs, an example of things that we can do on the roads to help accommodate for that reduction in our area of visual attention, placing signs and traffic signals in areas where they're most likely to be observed by approaching drivers. A no right turn on red at a signalized intersection. Well, that can help again overcome that diminished ability to make judgments in gaps and approaching traffic. And signal backplates with reflective borders, that can be helpful for contrast sensitivity, but also overcome some of the decreased dark adaptation. So perhaps giving a frame or a border around the light indicator at a signal to help discern it from background lighting that may exist along a corridor. So these are just some examples of safety enhancements. We're going to actually talk about most of these coming up, but I wanted to make that quick correlation to simple things that we do and how it relates to ways that we can try to overcome our natural diminished abilities in vision. So let's transition to the physical mobility capabilities that tend to diminish, and that's a reduction in strength and range of motion in arms, shoulders, and legs, and reductions in head, neck, and upper torso flexibility. Our ability to turn our necks can diminish as we age. So reductions in strength and range of motion for arms and shoulders and legs, these involve the tasks of turning a steering wheel in a car, being able to maneuver around obstacles or turn through intersections. And for our legs, our ability to shift from the accelerator to the brake and applying the correct brake pressure. And reductions in head, neck, and upper torso flexibility and motion. Now this can impact our ability to check for blind spots when changing lanes or merging, or our ability to even look for gaps in traffic, having to look to our left when making a right on red, or when pulling out from a minor street or driveway. And especially the ability to quickly look left, then right, then left again, if pulling out of a driveway or minor intersection and dealing with traffic that may be coming in two directions and having to judge for a gap in two directions. So one of the fun things that we do, if this were a workshop that we would hold live and in person, I do love the uh, ability for these virtual webinars to reach so many people, but it is kind of fun when we're a smaller group and in person in a class. And so one of the things that we've done in the past is actually have participants put on neck braces to simulate that reduction in the ability to turn our necks or upper torso, and to put on glasses that kind of mimic the effects of reductions in contrast sensitivity, something that mimics having cataracts, and also glasses that can show reductions in visual acuity. So putting on the filters over the eyes, putting the neck braces on, and then asking people to pretend that they now have to drive. And so it gives participants a greater appreciation of what aging drivers may be going through. And let's close out with talking about three cognitive capabilities that tend to diminish as we age. That's selective attention, perception reaction time, and working memory. So selective attention, that's our ability to process information simultaneously that may be coming at us from multiple sources, or even sometimes multiple senses. But in the driving task, it's primarily visual, although it could be visual and what we hear. So perhaps like a siren or a honking of a horn, but mostly visual. And having to observe, say, at an intersection, okay, what lane do I need to be in? Am I in a turn lane? Am I in a through lane? What route do I want to get to? Is the signal green? Is the signal red? And focusing on all of these things and trying to do that simultaneously, which we really can't. We think we're multi-processors, but we're really not. We're not able to multitask. Where we're really, we may be able to jump back and forth from different tasks rapidly, but we're really not multitasking. We're just quickly jumping from one task to another. So focusing on what lane I need to be in, what the signal indication is the car in front of me making a lane transition, all of this can really lead to complexity and explains why sometimes, well, a driver didn't see another vehicle that was pulling out of a driveway, or didn't see the cyclist that was approaching, or didn't see the pedestrian that came out of nowhere. Well, it's not that the pedestrian came out of nowhere. It's just that as human beings, we weren't able to simultaneously process all that could be happening, all of the complexities on the roadway, and that can contribute to crashes. And then even when we are able to visually see an object, it requires time to perceive what the appropriate reaction would be. On the roadway, it's typically the braking maneuver. So perception reaction time is commonly thought of as, well, I see an object. Well, it could be a pedestrian, it could be an object on the roadway, it could be a stopped vehicle ahead. Whatever the condition is, to see it is one thing, but then to cognitively perceive what the appropriate action is, such as braking or swerving around, making a lane change, and then executing or beginning to execute that maneuver. So if it's braking, it would be to put my foot on the brake and at least begin the braking maneuver. So this perception reaction time is something that is an assumption that highway designers use, and very commonly a 2.5 second perception reaction time is assumed for things like sight distance. How much forward sight distance do I need to see an object, perceive it, and then start a action like braking? And then, of course, there would be a braking distance or a deceleration distance. But perception reaction time is also something that can diminish as we age. And then lastly, working memory skills. That's our ability to recall information in active memory. So let's say someone gives you their phone number, a new phone number. You've never had it before, and you're trying to remember all the digits. Well, that's working memory, and it's challenging at any age sometimes to remember a phone number, and we can easily have that information wiped from our memory with just the slightest distraction. So on the road, an example of where working memory is applied is if we have dynamic message signs. And so trying to provide information to the motorist, like a exit is closed ahead, or a detour is ahead, or to reach a certain destination, take exit so-and-so. And so that information those are examples of what would be involved in working memory, and that can diminish as we age. So keeping the message simple, providing just the key information, and perhaps redundancy in how we present that. So those are examples of age-related diminishing capabilities. And when I asked you, is there anything about older drivers that perhaps annoys you? Well, now maybe we have a better appreciation for why older drivers uh, act or drive in those ways. Oftentimes it is because of these diminished capabilities, which is natural. So we're about to get into the section where we talk about things that are actually in the FHWA handbook. But let me take a pause here, and Mike, let's see if we have any questions that may have come in on the first two sections of what we've presented so far.
Thanks, Mark. Great information. At the moment, we don't see any questions in the questions box, but as a reminder to our audience, please feel free to type in any questions you might have. And also, in that GoToWebinar panel, we do have a section called Handouts that has a PDF copy of the participant workbook. And later this afternoon, of course, we'll have part 2 of this webinar series, and then we will be sending out a follow-up email that also will have a link to that PDF. So we'll make sure we get that workbook to you. But yes, we will keep the questions box open. So Mark, back to you.
Very good. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so let's proceed into the meat of our workshop today. And the FHWA handbook, it is broken up into chapters, and chapter 2 focuses on intersections. It is certainly the largest chapter in the handbook, and most of the recommendations actually do pertain to intersections, and there's a good reason for that. Intersections are challenging. They're challenging for users of all ages, but as we get older, the problems at intersections, or the demands placed on us at intersections, where we have to make rapid decisions about what lane to be in, what am I able to proceed? Is the signal green, or is the gap acceptable? So rapid decisions, quick reactions, making these accurate judgments in speed and distance, all of these are examples of abilities that can diminish with aging. So that is why intersections tend to stand out as a significant concern for older users. So whereas about 37% of traffic fatalities for people age 65 and older occur at intersections, compare that to only 18% for the 26 to 64 age group. So part of this is also due to the fact that when a collision occurs at an intersection, intersection crashes can be higher severity. If we think about some common collision types at intersections, say the permissive left turn, and if a driver misjudges the gap in oncoming traffic and makes a left turn in a shorter gap, and a collision occurs, well, the collision between two vehicles at a signalized intersection like that, if we think about the protection that our vehicles afford us, we actually have less protection on our sides. So our side doors, whether it's the driver's side door or passenger side door, compare that to if you're rear-ended. So the rear of a vehicle, or even the front of a vehicle, there's more of a crumple zone. There's more energy absorption that the body of the car can absorb than a crash that involves a 90-degree or T-bone type of collision, where a vehicle is getting hit on the side doors. So that the severity of intersection crashes tends to be of higher kinetic energy, and so for the aging population, that can result in this skew that we see more fatalities, more serious injuries among the older population, simply because of that type of collision being a high energy, high impact crash that tends to be less survivable as we age. And similarly for pedestrians, pedestrian fatalities at intersections are also overrepresented for people age 65 and older. And as a pedestrian involved in a collision with a car, a pedestrian doesn't have that shield of steel, the vehicle, that suit of armor protecting them. The pedestrian is most vulnerable, and absorbing those crash forces as an older person also has that inherent challenge of perhaps being less able to absorb collision forces as a pedestrian before harm occurs. So when we do see pedestrians getting hit, an older pedestrian is more likely to suffer a more severe consequence. So the data certainly reveals what intuitively makes a lot of sense. So bottom line, intersections are a particular challenge when we're talking about older driver safety. So the treatments or suggestions that are found in the FHWA handbook, they can be categorized or subcategorized into 4 areas: design, signing, markings and lighting, signals, and pedestrian crossings. And we're going to talk about them in these categories, starting with design. So these may be examples of things that are going to be applicable if we have an opportunity to redesign an intersection. So maybe we're making a improvement project, or maybe we have an opportunity for a safety project. But these are not going to be the lower cost type of recommendations. So before we begin, let me hit you with a little pre-test. This is a rhetorical question. We're not going to pull up a poll pod, but I want you to think about it and think about how you would answer this. So a little pre-test question here. An asymmetrical, three-centered compound radius design is best used for, is the answer A, the core of a stage 2 space rocket, B, a kyphoplasty orthopedic balloon, and I'll be honest, I have no idea what that means. C, estimating the surface area of a convex isogonal non-prismatic solid, or is the answer D, the curb radius of a driveway? Well, we'll get into it. The correct answer is D. Who knew that curb radius of a driveway could be so complex? But we'll talk about what we mean by an asymmetrical three-centered compound radius design. Wow, so complex just to design a simple curb radius. We'll get to that. So intersection treatments, we're going to talk about roundabouts. We're going to talk about reduced left turn conflict intersections, skew angle in intersections, curb radius, raised channelization, and sight distance, intersection sight distance. So let's start with roundabouts. Oh, I love roundabouts, and I think it's a great example of what we could do to make intersections safer, not just for the aging population, but really for everybody, but in particular for the aging population. And I know for the folks in Ohio, Ohio does a lot of great things with roundabouts, and so maybe preaching to the choir, and that's great. But roundabouts, just by their geometry, the physical geometry, eliminates the severe right angle crashes. So I've already talked about the problem of a permissive left turn at a signalized intersection, or the problems of judging for gaps in traffic as we're coming out of a minor street or a driveway. Well, a roundabout simplifies things so much. As a driver approaching the entry to the roundabout, you're really only encountering traffic that is coming from one direction, coming around the circulatory roadway, and traffic in the circulatory roadway is probably going slow because the radius, the inscribed circular diameter of that roundabout is controlling the speed. So it's easier to make that judgment in the gap because the vehicle in the circulatory roadway is going slower. You only have to worry about that one direction. A roundabout is kind of like a right in, right out intersection. It's not really a right turn, but it's kind of like a right turn when you are entering the circulatory roadway and leaving the circulatory roadway. So roundabouts eliminate those severe conflicts. They eliminate the crossing conflicts, the T-bone type collisions. We have lower speeds at a roundabout. So let me make a comparison here, and this is also where the safe system approach philosophy comes into play, that people make mistakes. So let's take a scenario of a driver approaching an intersection, and let's start off with, say, a signalized intersection. And let's say this approaching driver doesn't see that the light is red, and they blow through the red light, or they blow through a stop sign, and they collide with another vehicle going in the other direction from the other approaching road that maybe has the green signal indication. Well, that red light running type of collision, sadly, it's very common. Red light running is something that happens a lot around the country. They tend to be very severe crashes. But under a safe system approach, well, mistakes happen. So whether it was intentional, unintentional, may not matter. The crash occurs, probably going to be severe negative consequences. Let's take the same scenario, but now it's at a roundabout. That approaching driver coming up to the roundabout, let's say they don't slow down. Let's say they don't obey the traffic control device, the yield sign, total failure to yield, and they blow right into the circulatory roadway, just similar to what a red light runner might do. But this time it's at a roundabout, and let's think about how the consequence or the outcome may be changed. So first of all, the other driver that's in the circulatory roadway, so the driver that this approaching vehicle just runs into, well, at least the other car, the other vehicle in the circulatory roadway is probably going slower because their speed is controlled by the diameter of the roundabout. So even if we can't slow down the approaching driver, we've at least slowed down the other vehicle, reducing the kinetic energy of the crash. And another factor that reduces the kinetic energy of that collision is the impact angle. So instead of a collision occurring at a 90-degree kind of a T-bone type of crash from a red light running incident or blowing through a stop sign, if we have that same incident occur at a roundabout, the angle of impact of that collision, instead of being 90 degrees, it's going to be more along the lines of 40 to 50 degrees. That change in impact angle actually has a significant change in the kinetic energy involved in that crash. It reduces the kinetic energy actually by about as much as if the speeds of the colliding vehicles were actually about 20 miles an hour less. So even if we can't manage speeds, if we manage the collision angle of the impact, that also has a great influence on the kinetic energy of the crash. So roundabouts, by their general nature, just their design, the geometrics of them, even when crashes occur at roundabouts, they tend to be less severe. They tend to be more survivable. Tying in nicely with the safe system approach, saying humans are going to make mistakes, crashes are going to occur. Let's manage the consequence of the crash. And that's really what roundabouts do so well. Yes, crashes occur at roundabouts, happens, but they tend to be less severe. They tend to be more of the property damage only or minor injury crashes. It's rare, very rare, to have a fatality or serious injury crash. Not to say that we don't, but they just are a lot less likely. It reduces the probability of a fatality or serious injury outcome by taking an intersection and making it a roundabout. We're not eliminating the intersection. That would be great, right? If we could take all the intersections out of our network, our system. Yeah, can't do that, not really likely. But what we can take out are the severest conflicts. And at an intersection, it's those crossing conflicts where a T-bone type of collision, a 90-degree angle type of collision would occur. Those are the most severe. Those are what can be designed out. And a roundabout is a great example of how we as engineers, how we as transportation practitioners can design safety more inherently into the system. So I'm gonna hopefully stop my little preaching there on roundabouts, but they really are, I think, a great example of this philosophy of designing for a safe system and designing for an aging population. Now, roundabouts also have advantages for pedestrians. Pedestrians cross only one direction of traffic at a time. The splitter island can provide a refuge so that there's shorter crossing distances. Instead of crossing all the lanes at once, a pedestrian basically breaks up the crossing and only crosses one direction at a time and fewer lanes at a time. and the lower speeds of a roundabout have safety benefits for pedestrians. Even if a vehicle to pedestrian collision occurs, we hope they don't, but if a vehicle pedestrian collision does occur, the survivability of that collision increases with slower speeds. So the geometry of a roundabout promoting slower speeds, promotes better yielding, driver yielding to pedestrians, but then even if a collision occurs, it enhances the likelihood of the pedestrian being able to survive that collision. Roundabouts are particularly great when we've got skewed intersections or intersections with more than 4 approaches. Those types of intersections typically cry out for conversion into a roundabout. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that in the handbook, in the FHWA handbook, there is a statement or a recommendation that roundabouts be limited to 1-lane entrances and 1 lane of circulating traffic. So single-lane roundabouts, basically. And we know from experience that the crash the crash experience, the safety performance between single-lane roundabouts and multi-lane roundabouts does differ significantly. Single-lane roundabouts are simpler; they're easier to figure out. Once we add that second lane, a second entry lane, a second circulating lane, things can happen. And I'll talk just real quickly about some of the common challenges or conflicts, additional conflicts that can arise with multi-lane roundabouts that we don't have with a single lane roundabouts. And one common challenge with a multi-lane roundabout is a entering driver not yielding to both lanes, both circulating lanes in the roundabout. So for example, in that picture on the far left, you see the yellow car that's approaching, it would enter the roundabout, and the white car in the circulatory roadway, and that the white car is in the left lane or the second lane of the multi-lane roundabout, and let's say they are perhaps making the through movement. Maybe they came from the top of the photo, but the driver in the yellow car should yield to both circulating lanes of traffic in the roundabout. And what we commonly see is drivers yielding to the nearest lane, but not yielding so much to vehicles in the second lane. And sometimes, depending upon the geometry of the roundabout, like if it's a larger diameter roundabout and the distance between that approach leg and the downstream exit leg, if there's a large amount of separation, it may not seem intuitive, perhaps, to a driver of the need to yield to both lanes. If you think about perhaps a common maneuver at a traffic signalized intersection where a driver's making a right turn on red, and maybe there's no traffic in the nearest lane, the near lane that a driver making a right turn on red would be turning into, but maybe there's a through car coming in the second lane or the left lane. Well, you know, I'm sure we've all done that as drivers, where we make a right turn on red because the lane that we're turning into is open. And we hope that the driver that's in the second lane, the left lane, stays in their lane. But and if they do, then we don't have a conflict and everything is fine. At a roundabout, that same intuition wouldn't work because it's not just the lane that the driver's turning into, but the lane next to him where that vehicle may be leaving the circulatory roadway. And so that type of collision where entering a vehicle not yielding to an exiting vehicle in a multi-lane roundabout, we see that collision quite a bit. In the middle there, you see the example of failing to maintain lane position. So a vehicle that, well, we hope that 2 vehicles side by side in a multi-lane roundabout can enter both lanes simultaneously, but sometimes based upon poor geometry, a vehicle may encroach into the adjacent lane. So failure to maintain lane position at a multi-lane roundabout. Again, these don't happen at single lane roundabouts. These are just some common challenges at multi-lane roundabouts. And then lastly is making a improper turn. So most, say a 2-lane roundabout where a right lane and a left lane are entering the circulating roadway, a very common lane assignment is for both lanes to be able to proceed straight and making a left turn from the left lane or a right turn from the right lane. But sometimes we see drivers wanting to make a left turn from the right lane, and that could lead to a collision if the adjacent vehicle is legally going straight, making that straight maneuver. So these are 3 examples of common challenges at multi-lane roundabouts. Hence that recommendation in the handbook for single lane roundabouts. We know single lane roundabouts certainly have a better performance in terms of fewer crashes, but there is good news with multi-lane roundabouts. Even though these types of crashes are still fairly common at multi-lane roundabouts, the good news is they tend to be less severe. So when these crashes occur, because of the lower speeds, they tend to not result in severe injuries or fatalities. And multi-lane roundabouts, the design practices are continuing to evolve. The use of spiral types of designs or turbo types of designs. The spiral and turbo, it not only refers to the shape of the center island, but how the lanes are configured such that hopefully it's more obvious to a driver what lane they should be entering into the roundabout into, and also to not change lanes. So a feature of a turbo design is often some type of physical, like a raised curbing or some type of divider, or it could even be something like a rumble strip or enhanced pavement markings that just tries to tell the driver, stay in your lane. Don't make a left turn from the right lane. So a lot of enhancements for multi-lane roundabouts hopefully will help mitigate this common crash problem. And also I'm going to call it a hybrid or a 2x1 type of roundabout where the major street maybe has a 2-lane entry and 2-lane exit, but the minor street has a single lane entry and single lane exits. And so on the circulatory roadway, half of the circle is 2 lanes, half of the circle is 1 lane. The 2x1s also tend to have less of a problem with those collision types that we talked about a little while ago. So quick run through on roundabouts, not to be fearful of the multi-lane roundabouts, but no doubt if a single lane roundabout can do the job, stick with a single lane roundabout. It keeps things a lot simpler. Obviously, the reason we go to multi-lane roundabouts is for higher volumes, but when possible, try to keep the roundabout smaller when you can. And so things like the 2x1 option could be good if your minor street volumes are really such that you really don't need 2 lanes all the way around. Then don't put in 2 lanes all the way around. Or another strategy is to only put in multi-lanes when you need multi-lanes. So for example, if we're going to build a roundabout and a single lane roundabout may operate fine for many years to come, and just have the ability to expand the roundabout. So provide those additional lanes when the traffic volumes require it. That's another great example of planning for future expansion. But if you don't need the capacity of a multi-lane roundabout immediately on day one, we can certainly build roundabouts such that they are expandable in the future and operate as simpler roundabouts up until that point in time when that additional capacity is needed. So quick run through on roundabouts, but certainly a key example of what we can do to design roadways for an aging population. A related intersection treatment is the family of innovative intersections that FHWA refers to as reduced left turn conflict intersections. One of our proven safety countermeasures. These intersections are known by various names, like restricted crossing U-turn, median U-turn, J-turn, through turns. What's common about them is that they typically involve redirecting a left turn movement or left turn movements by way of a U-turn maneuver, a downstream U-turn maneuver. So in the case of a restricted crossing U-turn, for example, it's a great application at something like a multi-lane divided highway, like a rural higher speed multi-lane divided highway where the minor street is stop controlled. The major road doesn't have any stopping or not signal controlled. And at these types of intersections, rural areas are great examples of this. What we commonly observe is that drivers have a hard time judging for those gaps on the far side. So we may do okay looking to our left in the near lanes, but looking over toward the right across the median to judge that gap in the other direction, that's where drivers tend to struggle, including aging drivers. And so an overrepresentation of those far side right angle collisions, and those tend to be severe types of crashes, T-bone types of crashes. Those are exactly the collisions that are eliminated with a restricted crossing U-turn. So now traffic coming out of the minor street, all traffic makes a right turn. If they wanted to make the left turn maneuver or the crossing maneuver, they would do so by way of a downstream U-turn and then coming back. So the restricted crossing U-turn intersection, a great example of what we mean by a reduced left turn conflict intersection. It takes out that most severe type of conflict. So the R-cuts, the restricted crossing U-turn intersections, the median U-turns, if those are new concepts to you, I'd like to offer that you go visit the FHWA's Innovative Intersection webpage, and we have not only informational guides about these intersection designs, but also some really good explanation videos, including videos that are aimed toward the public. And so it's they're tools that we hope agencies can play at public meetings to help the general public better understand what these intersections really are all about and why they are safer. So the next design issue is intersection skew. And in a perfect world, all of our intersections would align at 90-degree angles, but we know that's not always the case. And so where skew really becomes problematic is when we have an angle of less than 75 degrees. And what a skew angle can do in terms of complicating the challenges for drivers is essentially having to look back. So let's say this minor street is stop controlled. And so drivers have to make a judgment in gaps of approaching traffic. Well, we already talked about the difficulty sometimes of having to turn our neck or upper torso, and that difficulty can become even more challenging when we have a bad skew angle. That look back angle to see approaching traffic really requires us to turn almost our whole bodies around. Also, as pedestrians, a skewed intersection has the effect of increasing the length of certain crosswalks, certain crossings. So anytime we can take a skew and eliminate it, like the photo on the right there, it really helps both drivers and pedestrians. And this concept of a look back angle and how that affects head turns. There has been some research on that, and it really does support this recommendation that skews become most problematic when we have skew angles less than 75 degrees, because then the head turning angle essentially becomes 140 degrees or possibly more. So the greater the skew, the greater that look back angle or head turn angle, and that can be problematic to older users. Some strategies: well, if it's a signalized intersection and the skew is severe like that, we could try to not have right turn on red. Another challenge that we can have at a skewed intersection: the ability for a driver to turn the steering wheel, which we talked about, the physical motion limitations in the shoulders and upper torso. Well, picture trying to make a left turn maneuver. It can be hard at any age, but especially for a older driver. If we have a badly skewed intersection and you're trying to make this left turn maneuver, not only is it a hard steer, a hard turn, but to have your vehicle enter the receiving lane can be challenging. So there is a recommendation in the handbook that talks about increasing the throat width of the receiving lane, and that could be a shoulder, could even be a bicycle lane. If it's a signalized intersection, we wouldn't have this conflict of the turning vehicle and a cyclist, but it basically allows for additional pavement, additional space in the receiving lane in the throat width. So that's really the basis behind that recommendation in the handbook. And so now we get to curb radius. All right, so the FHWA handbook does talk about keeping our corner curb radii in the range of 25 to 30 feet. And it's kind of a compromise. So a tight radius like that helps moderate the turning speed of vehicles. So it's a definite enhancement for pedestrian safety. It also helps reduce the crossing distance. But the trade-off is we also need to accommodate the swept path of larger vehicles that are making a right turn. So this is a classic balancing act that we as designers have to do at intersections. And a little bit of a difference in that radius actually makes a big difference in terms of these concerns of turning speed, crossing distance, and crossing distance is also crossing time, exposure that the pedestrian is in the crosswalk. So the difference between a 10-foot curb radius, a 25-foot curb radius, and a 50-foot curb radius actually makes a significant difference in terms of that pedestrian crossing length and the vehicle turning speed that that type of radius permits. So we want to balance it. We want to provide for the needs of a swept path right turning vehicle, let's say a truck, whatever our design vehicle is, but yet keep turning speeds slow and keep crossing distances as short as possible. So this is where some real good engineering comes in. Who knew that curb radius design could be so complicated? So the handbook does talk about things like the use of offsets, tapers, and compound curves. So instead of a simple radius like a 25-foot radius, maybe the use of a tapered or the 3-centered compound curve. What that is basically designing the radius with three separate radii, where the R1 is less than the R2 and that's less than the R3. So by having a small radius at the start of the turn, so that this can be both turning into the minor street and turning out from the minor street, so that the first radius that vehicle encounters is the R1 value. A small radius for R1 helps control turning speed. But then the larger radii of R2 and R3 provides for the swept path of larger vehicles. So a asymmetrical three-centered compound radius design for something seemingly simple like a driveway or a minor intersection, well, nothing is ever easy, right? But this is actually a good way of applying good engineering, good design, and trying to reach that good balance between slowing speeds, keeping crossing distances to a minimum, but yet providing for the needs of a swept path of a turning vehicle. And when we're thinking about the needs of the swept path of a turning vehicle, it is important to remember the difference between the actual curb radius and the effective turning radius. So if we have things like on-street parking, if we have things like a bike lane, those features can actually increase the effective turning radius that might be available to a vehicle. So this challenge of keeping turning speed slow, but yet providing for the swept path need, yeah, it is complicated. It's not something that is a cookie cutter type of design, but is something that is important to engineer. And right turn channelization, this is where raised islands come into play. A good design can provide as a refuge for pedestrians, but also this notion of controlling speeds. So some of the older channelization designs had provisions for basically higher speed right turn maneuvers. Also, it had that higher look back angle. A modern channelization design controls speeds and also limits that right turn or the look back angle. So it's kind of a combination of putting the pedestrian crosswalk in an area where it's going to be visible by an approaching driver. So within that 20-degree cone of vision, having that angle between the lanes and the turn lane about 45 to 60 degrees to control speeds, providing perhaps a three-centered, asymmetrical three-centered compound curve to control turning speed, but providing for the swept path of larger vehicles and keeping that look back angle to less than 150 degrees. So who knew that right turn channelization could be so complicated? Well, actually it is. And as a good reference, I'll point you to this report from the National Cooperative Highway Research Program, web document 208, really has good information. And the research results indicate that channelized right turn lanes have a definite role in improving operations and safety at intersections. And even if we can't physically change the right turn channelization, we can do things with markings. So here's a good example of a before and after comparison where the actual pavement didn't change, but the pavement markings were used to help create that more modern effect. And the refuge island design, things like cut-throughs can help with visually impaired pedestrians, help them provide their way, making sure that we use accessible designs on our refuge islands, all good examples of good pedestrian refuge areas. One last thing with right turn acceleration lanes, there is something in the handbook that talks about providing for a acceleration lane, and this is going to be for a rural condition. This is going to be an area where we don't have pedestrian activity, or at least not a lot of pedestrian activity. And so the notion here is at a skewed intersection where we have higher operating speeds and maybe difficulty in judging for those gaps in oncoming traffic, it makes it easier to have that right turn come into an acceleration lane. And drivers can better utilize their side view mirrors to look for gaps as they basically merge over a lane. So a right turn channelization with an acceleration lane, but just to point out, this is going to be more of a higher speed rural type of context as shown in the picture. And then so I'm going to take a pause here before we get into median and left turn channelization. We've got, yeah, I think we're right at 11:30, Mike. So I'm going to take a pause, and if we have questions in the chat pod, and I'd like to encourage people to continue putting questions in the chat pod. But when we come back from our break, we'll start addressing some of those questions. but we're at a good point to take our break for the afternoon. We're going to start back up right at 1 o'clock, promptly at 1 o'clock. So please try to log back in a few minutes before then, and we're going to finish talking about intersections and the other parts of the FHWA handbook. You don't have to stay logged into the room. You can, but if you log out of the room and then log back in, it is the same web link. So with that, Mike, why don't we go ahead and take our pause for the afternoon? Any other instructions that you want to give folks before we break for part one?
Thanks, Mark. I think we are good at this point, so we will go ahead and end part one of today's webinar series. And we look forward to seeing everybody at 1 p.m. Eastern Time this afternoon. So we will see you then. Thanks.